No one should eat Christmas Eve alone. 7 words. That's all it took. A 79-year-old widow sitting by herself at a restaurant on Christmas Eve. An empty chair where her husband used to sit. Her children didn't come. Her phone didn't ring. And then motorcycles. 9 of them. Leather jackets. Tattoos. A gang the whole town feared. And one of them walked straight to her table, pulled out a chair, and sat down. If this story moves you, subscribe to our channel, hit the bell, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The night Evelyn Harper walked into Pine Creek Grill alone, she told herself she was fine. She had been telling herself that for 9 months. 9 months since she had stood in a hospital hallway in Cedar Ridge, Montana, and listened to a doctor say words that didn't feel real. 9 months since she had watched them wheel Thomas away on a gurney and understood in the marrow of her bones that the man she had loved for 51 years was not coming back. 9 months of waking up to a half-empty coffee pot. 9 months of cooking meals for 2 and then throwing half away. 9 months of reaching across the bed in the middle of the night and touching cold sheets. 9 months of being fine. That was what she told her son Michael when he called from California 3 weeks before Christmas. "Mom, are you okay? Do you want me to come home for the holidays?" "Of course not," she said. "It's a long trip, sweetheart. You have the kids. I'll be perfectly fine." She meant it when she said it, or at least she thought she did. She told the same thing to her daughter Patricia, who called from Texas on a Tuesday afternoon while juggling a work meeting in the background. "Mama, we've been worried about you. Do you want us to fly up? We could make it work." "Patricia, I'm 79 years old, not 99. I've been taking care of myself for a very long time. Go enjoy the holidays with your family. I'll be fine." Fine, fine, fine. It was the word she had built a wall out of brick by brick since the day Thomas died. But Christmas Eve had a way of tearing walls down. She put on the red dress Thomas always loved, the one with the small buttons at the collar that he used to help her fasten because her fingers weren't as nimble as they used to be. She sat at her vanity mirror for a long time looking at her reflection, and she told the woman staring back at her, "You are going to walk in there, and you are going to have a lovely dinner, and it is going to be absolutely fine." The woman in the mirror didn't look convinced. Pine Creek Grill was everything she expected. Warm light, the smell of pine boughs and cinnamon, families packed into every corner, children in their Christmas sweaters, couples leaning close over candle-lit tables. The kind of place that was designed to make you feel like you were inside a Christmas card. Or if you were alone, like you were pressing your face against the glass from outside. The hostess, a young girl named Amber, who had known Evelyn for years, looked up from her podium and smiled. But there was something underneath the smile, something careful and kind and a little sad. "Mrs. Harper, it's so good to see you. Just the one tonight." Evelyn straightened her spine. "Just the one." Amber walked her to table 12. Their table. The corner booth by the frost-edged window that Thomas had requested every single year for 48 years because he liked to watch the snow. She slid the menu across and touched Evelyn's hand for just a moment. "I'll have Karen take care of you. She's wonderful." Evelyn sat down. She folded her hands in her lap. She looked across the table at the empty chair, the chair with no coat draped over it. No reading glasses set down beside the breadbasket. No large, warm hand reaching across to cover hers, and she said very quietly to no one at all, "Well, Thomas, here we are." She opened the menu. She didn't read a single word on it. Around her, the restaurant hummed and glowed. A little boy in a green sweater laughed so hard at something his grandfather said that he nearly fell out of his chair. 2 women at the next table were already on their second glass of wine, their heads tilted together like co-conspirators. A young couple in the far corner sat so close they were practically sharing the same seat, the girl wearing a ring that caught the light every time she moved her hand. Evelyn watched all of it, and for the first time since Thomas died, she didn't feel grief exactly. She felt something quieter and more dangerous than grief. She felt invisible. Karen came and took her order. She was cheerful and kind and called Evelyn honey in a way that felt genuine rather than practiced. She brought the bread basket and refilled the water glass and made small talk about the snowstorm rolling in from the north, predicted to hit Cedar Ridge hard by 10 o'clock. "Are you sure you don't want to start with the soup, honey? It's going to be a cold drive home." "The soup sounds lovely," Evelyn said. She ate the soup. She sat with the empty chair. She watched the snow begin to fall outside the window. Fat, lazy flakes that Thomas would have called the serious kind. And then she heard them. She heard them before she saw them, the low, rolling thunder of engines cutting through the cold night air. Once, the two of them were building on each other until the sound filled the parking lot and seeped through the walls of Pine Creek Grill like a physical presence. The restaurant changed. It was subtle at first, just a shift in energy, a ripple moving through the room. The little boy in the green sweater stopped laughing. The two women with their wine glasses looked toward the door. The young couple with the new rings straightened in their seats. Then the door opened. They came in single file, 9 of them, filling the entrance with leather and cold air and the particular kind of presence that makes a room hold its breath. Big men, hard men, men who looked like they had seen things that most people in this restaurant couldn't imagine. Their jackets were black with patches on the back, the unmistakable insignia of the HELLS Angels, and their boots left wet prints on the wooden floor, and their faces were weathered by roads and years, and a kind of living that didn't happen behind desks. The restaurant went absolutely completely silent. A mother at the table nearest the door pulled her daughter onto her lap without thinking about it, a reflex the way you'd pull a child back from a curb. 2 men near the bar straightened in their chairs. Evelyn saw Karen, the waitress, exchange a glance with the young hostess Amber, a glance that asked a question neither of them knew the answer to. The leader walked in last. He was broad across the shoulders in a way that suggested genuine physical strength rather than performance. His hair was dark with silver threading through it at the temples, and his face had deep lines around the eyes from years of squinting into wind and sun. There was a long scar along his left jaw that disappeared into a close-cropped beard. He moved with the deliberate ease of a man who had long ago stopped worrying about what rooms thought of him. His name, Evelyn would learn later, was Jack Mercer. The other writers called him Iron. He stood at the entrance and looked around the room with calm, measured eyes, taking it in, not aggressive, not apologetic, just present. The way a person stands in a room when they know exactly who they are and aren't interested in convincing anyone else. His eyes moved across the tables. They stopped when they reached table 12. They stopped on Evelyn. She felt it the moment he saw her. Not in an alarming way, not in the way that made her want to look away. In the way that you feel when someone actually looks at you. Not at your red dress or your white hair or the number on the table. At you. He looked at her for 3 seconds, maybe 4. Then he walked straight across the restaurant toward her table. The room watched. Evelyn watched too, her hands still folded in her lap, her soup bowl pushed to one side, her heart doing something she couldn't quite identify. Not fear, not quite. He reached her table. He pulled out the empty chair, Thomas's chair, without asking. He sat down across from her. He put his large hands flat on the white tablecloth, and he looked at her with those calm, weathered eyes, and he said, "No one should eat Christmas Eve alone." Evelyn Harper had not cried in front of another person since the funeral. She didn't cry now either, but it was a very close thing. For a long moment, she simply looked at him. At this enormous, scarred stranger who had walked across a restaurant full of frightened people to sit down uninvited at the table of a 79-year-old woman he had never met in his life. "My name is Evelyn," she said finally. "Jack," he said. He reached across the table and shook her hand with a gentleness completely at odds with the size of him. "Mind if my guys join us? I can't promise they're all good conversationalists, but they can eat." Something shifted in Evelyn's chest, something that had been locked tight for 9 months. "I've been sitting here for 40 minutes, she said with a dignity that was entirely her own, watching other people's families enjoy their Christmas. "I believe I can survive a few bikers." The right side of Jack's mouth moved, not quite a smile yet, close. He turned and nodded at the 8 men still standing near the entrance. They came. They came with their leather jackets and their boots and their road-worn faces, and they pulled chairs from nearby tables without asking anyone's permission. And they settled around Evelyn Harper like a wall being built. And within 4 minutes, the empty chair that Thomas used to sit in was no longer empty, and neither was the one beside it or the one beside that. Karen, the waitress, stood frozen for a moment, her order pad in hand, looking at the scene in front of her. "Ma'am," said a biker with a red beard and a gentle Oklahoma drawl, "any chance you've got a pie back there, because Jack hasn't let us stop for food since Billings and I am a man at the end of his patience." Karen blinked. She laughed. It broke the spell in the restaurant, one genuine startled laugh from a waitress who hadn't expected it, and suddenly the room began to breathe again. "We've got 3 kinds, she said. God bless Pine Creek Grill, the man said solemnly, and placed his menu down like a man making peace with the world. Evelyn watched this exchange and felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't even known was tight. How long have you been riding? She asked Jack. He considered the question with the seriousness it didn't particularly deserve, which told her something about him right there. Since I was 19, he said. My father had a bike, old Indian Scout, falling apart at the seams. He said riding it was the only time his brain went quiet. He paused. Took me a few years to understand what he meant. And do you understand it now? Some days, he said, not as many as I'd like. She liked that answer. She liked that he didn't pretend. Across the table, two of the other riders had started talking to each other, and their conversation drifted towards her naturally the way conversations do when people aren't performing them. Told you the past was going to be bad. The past was fine. It was your writing that was the problem. My writing is flawless. Ask anyone at this table. The table has known you for 11 years and will not be providing a character reference. Evelyn laughed. It surprised her. It came out of her before she knew it was coming, a real laugh, not the polite kind she had been practicing for months. Jack looked at her when she laughed. There was something in his expression, not a smile exactly, but something warmer than that. Recognition, maybe. Relief. Tommy, he called to the rider with the Oklahoma drawl. You're entertaining the lady. I'm entertaining everybody, Tommy said serenely without looking up from the menu. It's a gift. The food came. And with the food came something Evelyn hadn't expected: conversation. Real conversation. Not the careful, well-meaning conversation people had been having with her for 9 months. The kind where everyone chose their words slowly, where no one had mentioned Thomas by name, where the subject of loneliness was circled around so carefully it might as well have been a hole in the ground. A rider named Dennis, who had close-cropped gray hair and the kind of face that had seen considerable weather, put down his fork at one point and said simply, I lost my wife 4 years ago. Breast cancer. 3rd time she'd had it. The table quieted. The first 2 times, Dennis said, she beat it so completely I started to believe she was made of something different than the rest of us. Something tougher. He looked down at his plate. Turns out she was just very determined. I'm sorry, Evelyn said. Me too. He looked up at her. How long were you married? 51 years, Evelyn said. Dennis let out a slow breath. That's a long time to share a life with someone. It wasn't long enough, she said. It's never long enough. And the table 9 men who had ridden through 3 states in December cold, who wore their toughness like a second skin, who did not as a rule discuss grief over restaurant meals, sat with that truth for a moment without flinching. It was Tommy who finally spoke. My boy stopped calling about 3 years ago, he said to no one in particular. Don't know exactly what I did. Could have been 100 things. Maybe I wasn't around enough when he was small. Maybe the road took too much of me. He shrugged, but his eyes didn't match the shrug. I call every Sunday. He answers maybe once a month. Evelyn looked at this man, this large, road-roughened man with the Oklahoma drawl and the 3 kinds of pie appetite, and she saw something she recognized instantly. The particular grief of being forgotten by someone who is still alive. My children are alive and healthy, she said quietly, and they didn't come for Christmas. Nobody offered her a platitude. Nobody said, I'm sure they meant to, or I'm sure they'll call later, or I'm sure they feel terrible about it. Jack just looked at her directly and said, that's hard. 2 words, that's hard. And those 2 words, with no softening and no apology and no attempt to fix anything, were the most honest thing anyone had said to Evelyn Harper in 9 months. She felt the back of her eyes sting. She blinked it away. My husband, Thomas, she said, and she realized as she said his name out loud in this room full of strangers that it was the first time she'd said it in weeks without feeling like she was stepping off a ledge. He used to say that Christmas was the only night of the year when the whole world slowed down long enough to remember what mattered. Smart man, Jack said. I was the smartest man I ever knew, Evelyn said. He was also the most stubborn and occasionally infuriating. And he snored like a freight train every night for 51 years, she paused. I would give everything I owned to hear that snoring one more time. Nobody laughed, but the silence they offered her was warm. It was around this point that Evelyn noticed the restaurant had changed again. The tension that had filled the room when the HELLS Angels walked in, that collective held breath, that ripple of fear, had gradually, almost imperceptibly dissolved. People were looking at table 12 not with wariness now, but with something different. something that took her a moment to identify, curiosity, and something softer than curiosity. A man at the next table, heavy-set, mid-60s, eating alone with a paperback novel face down beside his plate, was watching them openly. Evelyn caught his eye. He looked away quickly, then looked back. She smiled at him. He blinked. On impulse, she said, "Would you like to join us? We seem to have collected quite a crowd. One more won't upset anything." He stared at her. I, I don't want to intrude." "Young man," Evelyn said with the particular authority of a woman who has reached an age where she no longer asks permission for things, "you are eating a Christmas Eve dinner alone with a paperback novel. The novel will wait. Come sit down." He came. His name was Gerald. He was 68 years old. He had driven 18-wheelers for 32 years, and he was passing through Cedar Ridge on his way to a delivery. And he had a daughter in Oregon he hadn't spoken to in 2 years over something he described as a misunderstanding about money that went sideways. He shook hands around the table with the formality of a man unaccustomed to being welcomed. Tommy immediately poured him a glass of water and said, "You want pie? Say yes. It's the best decision you'll make today." Gerald said yes. It was Jack who noticed the nurse. She was sitting at the far end of the bar in her scrubs, still in her hospital badge, her coat folded on the stool beside her. She had the look of someone who had just come off a long shift and hadn't quite figured out where to go next. She was drinking coffee and looking at nothing. "Excuse me, Bichet," Jack said to Evelyn and crossed the restaurant. Evelyn watched him approach the woman, watched him say something quiet, watched the woman shake her head then look up, watched something move across her face. She came back with Jack. Her name was Sandra. She worked labor and delivery at Cedar Ridge Memorial. She had worked the last 6 Christmases because she was single and the married nurses needed the holiday. She said this without bitterness, just the flat matter-of-fact tone of someone who had made peace with a situation without actually making peace with it. 6 Christmases, Evelyn said. 6, Sandra confirmed. She looked around the table at the bikers, at Gerald the truck driver, at Evelyn, in her red dress, and something in her posture changed, softened. "This is the strangest Christmas Eve I've ever had." "That makes 2 of us," Evelyn said. "Possibly 9 of us. Sit down, Sandra." Sandra sat down. And the table that had started as one empty chair in a corner booth was now something else entirely. Something none of them had planned, and none of them could quite name. Not a party, not a gathering exactly. Something more like what happens when people stop pretending. The snow outside was falling harder now. Real snow, the heavy, committed kind that changes the look of the world. Through the window, the parking lot was disappearing under white, and the motorcycles stood in a row like patient dark horses, their chrome catching the light from the restaurant windows. Evelyn looked at them and thought of Thomas, who had been afraid of motorcycles his whole life, who had made her promise twice never to ride one, who would have looked at this table full of strangers and bikers and a nurse in her scrubs and probably laughed until he cried. She thought, "Thomas, you would not believe this evening." And then quietly, privately, in a way that didn't show on her face, "I think you sent them." Jack was watching her. "Where did you go just now?" he asked. She considered denying it, giving him the fine answer, the wall brick answer. Instead, she said, I was thinking about my husband, thinking he would have enjoyed this." Jack nodded slowly. "Tell me about him." So she did. She told Jack Mercer about Thomas Harper, about the man who had driven a school bus for 22 years and known every child's name on his road, about the man who grew tomatoes every summer and gave 90% of them away to the neighbors, about the man who had been so nervous at their wedding that he had said his own name wrong during the vows and made the whole church laugh, about the man who held her hand during every hard moment of their life together, as if his hand could transfer some of his calm directly into her bones. She told him about the last year when Thomas's health had begun its slow, stubborn decline, and the way Thomas had refused to acknowledge it until he simply couldn't anymore. And the argument they'd had in March, a real argument, voices raised, something they almost never did, because he wouldn't let her call the doctor. He said he wasn't ready to hear bad news, she said. I told him bad news didn't care whether he was ready. She looked at her hands. He went to the doctor the next week, and the news was bad, and we held each other in the car outside the medical office for a very long time. The table was quiet. I'm glad you argued, Jack said. She looked at him. Some people never argue, he said. They never say the hard things. They keep everything smooth, and then one day it's too late to say anything at all. He turned his water glass in his hands. At least you were real with each other, right to the end. Evelyn looked at this man, this rough, road-worn, scar-jawed man who had no reason in the world to sit at her table and every reason in the world to have kept writing. And she thought, where did you come from? You're not what I expected, she said. He raised an eyebrow. What did you expect? I don't know exactly. Less, she searched for the word. Less wisdom. The right side of his mouth moved again. This time it was definitely a smile. Don't let the jacket fool you, Tommy said from across the table around a mouthful of apple pie. He reads philosophy. It's embarrassing. Marcus Aurelius, Dennis said, nodding. On the road, in the rain. A man has to do something with his evenings, Jack said without embarrassment. Evelyn looked around the table, at these men she had been afraid of 60 minutes ago. At Gerald, their truck driver, who was laughing at something Tommy said with the unguarded laugh of a man who had forgotten for a moment about his estranged daughter in Oregon. At Sandra, the nurse who had her elbows on the table now and was deep in conversation with Dennis about the particular loneliness of working in a hospital on holidays, about the babies she had delivered on Christmas morning, about the families who came running down the corridor at 3 a.m, and the way their faces changed when they first heard the cry. The restaurant around them had grown quieter as the evening deepened and families finished their dinners and headed home to wrap presents and put children to bed. But table 12 remained, and in the remaining it had become something. Evelyn could feel it, the particular quality of this moment, the way it sat differently from the moments before it, the way Thomas used to say that certain evenings had a weight to them, a significance you could feel while they were still happening, not just when you looked back. She had driven to this restaurant alone tonight, believing she was fine. She was not fine. But sitting here at this overcrowded table with these people who had no reason to be here and every reason to be kind, she thought perhaps fine was not the only option. Perhaps there was something better than fine waiting on the other side of the wall she had built. She didn't know yet what it was. But for the first time in 9 months, she was curious to find out. Outside, the snow fell and fell, blanketing Cedar Ridge in white, covering the parking lot and the motorcycles and the highway beyond, and the night deepened toward midnight, and inside Pine Creek Grill table 12 held. It was Tommy who first noticed the boy. I was maybe 14, sitting 2 tables over, wearing a too big coat that probably belonged to someone else, eating a bowl of soup like a person trying to make it last as long as possible. No adult with him, no phone on the table, just a kid and a bowl of soup and the particular stillness of someone who has learned how to be invisible in public spaces. Tommy set down his fork. He didn't say anything. He just looked at Jack. Jack had already seen him. Hey, Jack said, not loudly, just enough to carry. The boy looked up. His eyes went immediately to the leather jacket, to the patches, and for a split second his whole body prepared to disappear. You eaten anything besides that soup tonight? The boy's jaw tightened. I'm fine. Evelyn heard that word fine and felt it land somewhere specific in her chest. Of course you are, Jack said with no sarcasm whatsoever. But we've got pie over here and Tommy's going to eat all of it if somebody doesn't intervene. You'd be doing us a favor. The boy looked at Tommy. Tommy held up both hands in a gesture of absolute sincerity. I have no self-control around pie, Tommy said. It's documented. The boy almost smiled. Almost. I don't want to bother anyone, he said. Sancha, Gerald said from the other side of the table in the measured tone of a man who had spent 30 years talking to dispatchers and dock workers and all manner of people who didn't want to be a bother. You're at a table with 9 bikers, a retired truck driver, a nurse who just got off a double shift, and a 79-year-old woman in a red dress. The bar for bothering us is very, very high. That did it. The boy picked up his soup bowl and moved to their table, and his name was Connor, and he was 15, not 14. He was particular about that, and his mother was working a double shift at the gas station on Route 12 because her manager had called in sick, and she couldn't afford to say no. And his stepfather was somewhere Connor didn't specify and didn't seem to want to. And he had walked to Pine Creek Grill because it was warm, and the soup was $3, and he had 4. He said all of this very quickly in the tone of someone who has delivered this kind of explanation before and has learned to get it over with efficiently before the pity arrives. The pity did not arrive. What arrived instead was a plate of turkey with all the sides because Karen the waitress had heard enough of the story to take it upon herself in a piece of apple pie. and Tommy pointing at the pie and saying, "That one's yours. Nobody else touches it." "I'm serious, Dennis. I will physically defend that slice." Dennis put his hands up. "I wasn't even looking at it." "You were looking at it." Connor ate. He ate with the focused concentration of a 15-year-old boy who was genuinely hungry and had been trying not to show it for the better part of an hour. Evelyn watched him and felt something move through her, not pity, something sharper than pity, something closer to fury, quiet and private, and aimed at a world that left 15-year-old boys alone on Christmas Eve with $4 and a bowl of soup. "Does your mother know where you are?" she asked him. "I texted her," Connor said with his mouth not quite empty. Then remembering, he swallowed and said, "Sorry, yes ma'am, she knows." "Good," Evelyn said. "Eat." He ate. And while he ate, the table talked around him, not performing for him, not adjusting themselves, just being what they had already become in the last hour, which was a collection of people who had stopped pretending they were fine. Connor listened. Evelyn could see him listening, could see him taking it in the men who talked about loneliness without embarrassment. The nurse who described delivering a baby at midnight on Christmas morning 2 years ago and crying in the supply closet afterward because no one was there to share it with the old woman in the red dress who talked about her husband like he had just stepped out of the room. At one point, without any particular warning, Connor said, "My dad left when I was 6. No, he made a sound. My real dad, I mean, not," he gestured vaguely in the direction of the stepfather he hadn't specified. "My real dad used to take me fishing. I don't even like fishing, but I liked going." He looked down at his pie. "He lives in Denver now, has a new family. He calls on my birthday sometimes. Not always." Tommy put down his coffee cup. "That's a hard thing," Tommy said. Connor looked at him. "Yeah. My son doesn't call me much either," Tommy said. "I've been on the other side of that fence. For what it's worth, it's not about you. It never was." Connor processed this in silence for a moment. Then he said, "How do you know that it's not about me?" "Because you're 15 and you've done nothing in 15 years that would make a grown man choose distance over his own kid. That's his failure, not yours." Tommy's voice was level and certain. "You hear me?" Connor looked at him for a long moment. Something in his face was doing something complicated. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Okay." "Okay," Tommy said and picked his coffee back up like the conversation was simply finished and didn't need anything else from either of them. Evelyn looked at Tommy, this rumpled, drawling, pie-obsessed man, and thought, there it is. There is the thing underneath all of it. It was around 10 o'clock when the wind shifted and the storm outside announced its intentions. Karen came out from behind the bar with the particular expression of someone about to deliver news nobody asked for. "Highway Patrol just called the grill. They're asking people to shelter in place if they can. Highway 2 northbound is closed. Whiteout conditions. The pass is completely shut." The table absorbed this. "Well," Dennis said, "that simplifies the evening." "You're not concerned?" Sandra asked him. "I've been riding through Montana winters for 23 years, Dennis said. "I have learned to work with weather rather than against it. The storm will pass. The highway will open. Tonight we sit." Jack looked at Evelyn. "You're not going anywhere in this. Neither are we." "I wasn't planning on it," Evelyn said with a composure she did not entirely feel. The restaurant, which had been gradually emptying as families headed home before the storm worsened, now held only a handful of tables. Pine Creek Grill's owner, a stocky, silver-haired man named Phil Okafor, who had run the place for 19 years, came out from the kitchen and looked at the situation with the eyes of a man rapidly recalculating. "Kitchen stays open," he said without anyone asking. "Long as people need a warm place, we're open." He looked at Karen. "Tell the other girls they can sleep in the break room if the storm doesn't break." "Phil," Karen said, "you're a good man." "I'm a practical man," Phil said. "Good and practical are the same thing on nights like this." He looked at the table, at the bikers and the truck driver and the nurse and the teenager and the old woman in the red dress, and something moved across his face that he controlled quickly. "Can I get anyone anything else?" "Coffee," said 8 voices at once. Phil almost smiled. He went back to the kitchen. And the storm sealed them in, and the table remained, and something shifted again deeper, this time more settled. The performance of the early evening, the careful testing of waters, the quiet measuring of each other gave way to something more honest, more tired, more real. It was Sandra who said it first. "Can I ask, why do you ride on Christmas Eve, all of you? Why not stay home?" The table considered this question with the seriousness it deserved. It was Dennis who answered. Because home isn't always a place, he said. Sometimes it's a condition. And some of us, he looked around the table with those weathered eyes, some of us haven't been able to find the right conditions in a while. Sandra was quiet. My wife left, said a writer named Paul who had been mostly silent all evening and had the kind of quiet that suggested a great deal happening underneath it. He was the youngest of the group, maybe early 40s, with careful hands and a voice he used sparingly. 2 years ago, she said I was more married to the road than to her. He turned his coffee cup in circles on the table. She wasn't wrong, I just didn't know how to be any different. I still don't, really. Have you tried? Sandra asked, not unkindly, directly. Paul looked at her. I'm starting to think trying looks different than I thought it did. What did you think it looked like? I thought it looked like stopping, he said. Stopping the road, stopping the writing, stopping me, basically. And I couldn't figure out how to do that without losing the only thing that ever made me feel like myself. And now I think maybe trying looks more like, he searched for it, like showing up, even when it's inconvenient, even when it's uncomfortable. He glanced at Evelyn, like tonight. Evelyn had been listening to Paul with the full attention she had given to very few people in the last 9 months. You know, she said slowly, Thomas tried to stop me from doing things I loved more times than I can count. Bridge club, my garden, a terrible soap opera he thought was beneath me. A pause. I kept doing all of them, and eventually he'd come and sit in the garden with me while I weeded, complaining the whole time. That was his version of support. Paul smiled. It transformed his face. That sounds like support to me, he said. It was the best kind, Evelyn agreed. The mini-climax of the night arrived quietly, the way the most significant things often do. Connor's phone rang. He looked at the screen. His face changed, not dramatically, not in a way that announced itself, but in the way that 15-year-old faces change when something they've been bracing against finally happens. It's my mom, he said. Answer it, Evelyn said. He answered it. Hey, Mom. Yeah, I'm okay. I'm at the grill. The storm. A long pause while he listened. His eyes moved around the table, taking in the faces watching him with a kind of careful, undemanding attention. No, I'm not alone. I'm with some people. Another pause. Good people, Mom. Yeah. He looked at Evelyn when he said it. Really good people. Evelyn felt the back of her eyes sting for the second time that night. She let it sting. She didn't blink it away this time. Connor hung up. She's stuck at the station until the storm breaks, he said. She said? He stopped, swallowed. She said she was glad I wasn't alone. You're not, Tommy said simply. Connor nodded. He looked down at his empty pie plate. Then he looked up at Tommy with the directness that teenagers sometimes produce, sudden and unguarded and completely honest. Why do you guys do this, he asked. Come to random restaurants on Christmas Eve. Sit with strangers. You don't know us. We don't know you. Why? Tommy looked at Jack. Jack looked at Connor. 3 years ago, Jack said. I spent Christmas Eve alone in a parking lot outside a bar in Nevada. I didn't go in. I just sat there in the cold for about 2 hours. He was matter-of-fact about it. No drama, no performance. It was the lowest I've ever been, and I kept thinking if one person, just one person had noticed, had come outside and said anything at all. He stopped. Nobody did. The table was very quiet. So now we notice, Jack said. Connor looked at him for a long moment. That's it, he said. That's the whole reason. That's the whole reason, Jack said. Connor nodded slowly, like someone filing something away somewhere it would stay. It was Phil who interrupted, coming out of the kitchen at 10:40 with a tray of mugs and a look on his face that was trying very hard to be businesslike. Coffee's fresh, and he set the tray down and rubbed the back of his neck. My wife passed 4 years ago, December. I work every Christmas Eve because I can't. I don't. He stopped. Tried again. I cook because it's the only thing that makes the night feel useful. Nobody said anything for a beat. Then Evelyn said, Phil, sit down. I have a kitchen. The kitchen will survive 15 minutes. Sit down. Phil Okafor, who had owned Pine Creek Grill for 19 years and had never once sat down at a customer's table while the restaurant was open, sat down. And the table that had started as one empty chair grew by one more. The storm howled. The night deepened. Outside, Cedar Ridge disappeared under white. Inside, at a corner table by a frost-edged window, A group of people who had no reason to belong to each other sat in the warmth and talked and listened and occasionally laughed. Evelyn looked around the table at 10:58 at Jack and Dennis and Tommy and Paul and the others, at Gerald the truck driver, at Sandra the nurse, at Connor, the 15-year-old who had walked in with $4 and had somehow stumbled into the most honest room he'd probably ever been in, at Phil the restaurant owner, who was crying quietly into his coffee and not bothering to hide it. She thought Thomas was right. Christmas is the only night when the world slows down long enough to remember what matters. She thought, I have been fine for 9 months. She thought, I am done being fine. And then at the exact moment she was thinking this, at 10:59 on Christmas Eve, the front door of Pine Creek Grill swung open. Cold air flooded the room, and a man walked in who made every single head at table 12 turn. I was 60 years old, expensively dressed in a cashmere coat that did not belong in Cedar Ridge on a night like this. And he was the kind of man whose very posture communicated that he expected rooms to rearrange themselves around him. He stamped snow from his shoes with the irritation of a man who found the weather personally offensive, looked around Pine Creek Grill with the assessing eyes of someone doing a rapid calculation of whether a place was worth his time. His eyes landed on table 12, on the HELLS Angels, on the teenager, on the crying restaurant owner, on the old woman in the red dress who was looking back at him with the calm, unimpressed gaze of someone who had stopped being intimidated by difficult men sometime around her 65th birthday. Richard Calloway had not come to Pine Creek Grill for a warm welcome. He had come because it was the only restaurant still open in Cedar Ridge, and he needed somewhere to wait out the storm, and he had not even remotely anticipated what he would find when he arrived. He took in the scene for exactly 4 seconds. Then, loudly enough for the whole remaining restaurant to hear, he said, "What in the hell is going on at that table?" And the evening, which had been building towards something without knowing what it was, arrived. Richard Calloway was the kind of man who had never once in 60 years walked into a room and not immediately known where the power was. He knew it now, and it was not where he expected it to be. He stood at the entrance of Pine Creek Grill with snow melting off his cashmere coat, looking at table 12 with the expression of a man who has opened a door expecting one thing and found something entirely different on the other side. His jaw was set. His eyes were moving rapidly from the leather jackets to the patches, to the teenager, to the crying restaurant owner, to the old woman in the red dress who had not looked away from him once since he walked in. "I asked a question," Richard said, louder this time, addressing the room generally. "What is going on at that table?" Nobody answered him immediately. That was unusual. Richard Calloway was not accustomed to silences that didn't rush to fill themselves on his behalf. Phil stood up from the table. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, not embarrassed, just matter of fact, and said, "Mr. Calloway, the storm's got us all pinned. Kitchen's still open. I can get you a table." "I don't want a table, Phil. I want to know why there are HELLS Angels in your restaurant on Christmas Eve sitting with—" His eyes moved to Connor, to Evelyn, "with a child and an elderly woman. They're sitting with us because we invited them," Evelyn said. Her voice was completely level, not aggressive, not apologetic. The voice of a woman who had raised 2 children and managed a difficult man for 51 years, and was not about to be made to feel small in a restaurant she had been coming to for 4 decades. Richard looked at her. Something shifted in his expression, a recalibration rapid and practiced. "Mrs. Harper," he said, and his tone adjusted into something that was almost gentle, almost concerned. "Are you all right? Did these men approach you?" "One of them did," Evelyn said. "I was sitting alone. He sat down. I was grateful." "You were—" Richard stopped, restarted. "Mrs. Harper, do you know who these people are?" "I know exactly who these people are," Evelyn said. "Do you?" Richard's jaw tightened. He looked at Jack. Jack had not moved, had not stood, had not changed his posture or his expression by a single degree. He sat with his large hands flat on the table and looked at Richard Calloway with the calm, unhurried patience of a man who has been looked at that way before and has long since stopped letting it mean anything. "You got a problem you want to talk about," Jack said quietly. "I'm right here." "My problem," Richard said, and now the almost gentleness was gone, replaced by something harder and more familiar, "is that I'm sitting in a family restaurant on Christmas Eve, and I'm looking at a table full of what?" Tommy said. The question hung in the air. Tommy had not raised his voice. He had simply asked it in his Oklahoma drawl, the way you'd ask someone to pass the salt. But there was something underneath it that was not soft at all. Richard looked at Tommy. I know what you are, he said. I know what that patch means. I know what your organization has done. Then you know more about us than most people in this room, Tommy said. What's your organization done lately? Mr. Calloway, Richard Calloway. I own the Calloway Development Group. I've built half the commercial real estate in this county. He said it the way people say things they've said many times in many rooms to great effect. Congratulations, Tommy said. That doesn't answer my question. Richard's face darkened. He turned to the remaining customers in the restaurant, two couples who had stayed, an older man in a flannel shirt at the bar. Does nobody here have a problem with this? He demanded. You're just going to sit here and let this happen. The man in the flannel shirt, who had been nursing a cup of coffee at the bar for the last 20 minutes and had, Evelyn noticed, been listening to the table with increasing attention, turned on his stool. Let what happen, he said. From where I'm sitting, those folks have been quiet and decent for 2 hours, which is more than I can say for the last 60 seconds. Richard stared at him. The man shrugged and turned back to his coffee. Sir, said one of the remaining bikers, a man named Roy Heavyset with a gray beard and the deliberate stillness of someone choosing his words carefully. I understand you are uncomfortable. I understand what you see when you look at us. I've been seeing that look my whole adult life. But I'd ask you to consider the possibility that what you're seeing and what's actually happening are two different things. What's actually happening, Richard said, is that a vulnerable, elderly woman is sitting surrounded by, I am not vulnerable, Evelyn said. The words came out sharp and clean with a precision that stopped Richard mid-sentence. I am 79 years old, she said, and I have been making my own decisions since before you were born. I am not vulnerable. I am not confused, and I am not in need of your protection. She paused, and in the pause was everything she'd been carrying for 9 months. Everything she'd been swallowing every time she said fine. What I was 2 hours ago was alone, and these men, she gestured around the table, noticed, which is more than my own children managed to do. Something in the restaurant shifted, not gradually the way it had been shifting all evening. Suddenly, the couple nearest the door, who had been watching Richard with the uncertain expressions of people who weren't sure which side of something they were on, made their decision visible. The woman reached across and took her husband's hand. The husband looked at Richard and looked away, a dismissal so quiet it was almost worse than a loud one. Richard felt it. He was smart enough to feel it. He looked around the room and saw that the tide had moved while he was talking, and he was standing on the wrong side of it. He tried a different angle. He pulled out his phone. I'm calling the sheriff, he said. This is a public safety issue. Highways closed, there are motorcycles in the parking lot, and I'm not comfortable with what exactly, Sandra said. She had been quiet for the last several minutes. When she spoke now, she spoke with the particular directness of a woman who had spent 12 years working emergency medicine, who had seen people at their worst and their best and had stopped having patience for performance somewhere around year 4. Because I've been sitting at this table all evening, Sandra continued, and I haven't seen a single thing that constitutes a public safety issue. I've seen people share food and tell the truth to each other. I've seen a 15-year-old kid eat a hot meal and feel less alone than he did an hour ago. I've seen a man who lost his wife cry in front of strangers without being ashamed of it. She looked at Richard steadily. Which part of that are you calling the sheriff about? Richard lowered his phone slightly. He had not expected the nurse. This isn't your business, he said to her. I made it my business when I sat down, she said. That's generally how belonging somewhere works. The front door opened again. 2 Cedar Ridge sheriff's deputies came in, bringing cold air and the smell of snow. They were young, both of them under 35, and they looked at the room with the alert, rapid assessment of people trained to read situations fast. The senior deputy, a tall man named Webb, with a careful face, took in the scene. He took it in completely and with evident experience, moving his eyes from Richard Calloway, standing alone near the entrance to table 12, packed with a collection of people that probably didn't look on the surface like it made any sense. We got a call, Deputy Webb said. Reported disturbance. There's no disturbance, Phil said from behind the counter. There's a storm and there's dinner, that's all. Webb looked at Richard. Sir, did you place the call? He did, Richard said. There are Hell's Angels in this restaurant, and I felt, have they threatened anyone? Not in so many words, but damaged any property. No, but asked anyone to leave. Richard stopped. No, he said. Webb nodded slowly. He looked at the table. His eyes moved across each face: Jack, Dennis, Tommy, Roy, Paul, the others, Gerald, Sandra, Connor, Phil, Evelyn. He stopped on Evelyn. "Ma'am," he said, "are you here of your own choosing?" "I am," Evelyn said. "Are you comfortable?" "More than I've been in 9 months," she said. Webb looked back at Richard. "Sir," he said, with the very specific politeness of a law enforcement officer who has already formed an opinion and is not going to share it. "It sounds like this is a group of people waiting out a storm together. I don't see a disturbance here." "Then what do you see?" Richard demanded. Webb considered this for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. "Dinner," he said. Richard's face went through several things in rapid succession. Evelyn watched it happen and felt no satisfaction, only a kind of quiet exhaustion for the energy it took to be that certain and that wrong simultaneously. "I want it on record," Richard said stiffly, "that I raised a concern." "So noted," Webb said pleasantly. Richard turned and walked to the far corner of the restaurant, as far from table 12 as it was physically possible to get, and sat down alone with his cashmere coat and his phone and his certainty, and did not speak again. The second deputy, younger, a woman named Torres with dark hair pulled back tight, lingered near the door for a moment. She looked at the table. Then almost imperceptibly, she looked at Jack. Jack met her eyes. She gave him the smallest nod. He gave it back. Then she followed Webb back out into the storm. The restaurant exhaled. Connor let out a long breath he had apparently been holding for the duration of the confrontation. "That was intense," he said. "That," Tommy said, pouring himself more coffee with the equanimity of a man who has navigated considerably more intense things, "was nothing." "You want intense? I'll tell you about the time we got stranded in Amarillo during a tornado warning with a broken down bike and a very angry gas station owner. This was a Tuesday." Connor stared at him. "You're messing with me." "I am absolutely not messing with you." The laughter that moved around the table was genuine and a little giddy. The particular laughter of people who have just collectively survived something and feel the relief of the other side. But Evelyn wasn't laughing. She was looking at Richard Calloway sitting alone in his corner, and she was thinking something she hadn't expected to think. She was thinking, "I know that man. Not personally, not specifically, but she knew the shape of him. She had known people shaped like that, people whose armor was so old and so well made that they had forgotten they were wearing it. People who led with power because they had learned somewhere early that leading with anything softer got you hurt. Thomas had a brother like that. His name was Frank, and he was combative and defensive and difficult and exhausting. And Thomas had loved him anyway with a patience that Evelyn had sometimes found maddening. "You can't fix Frank," Thomas used to say, "but you can refuse to make him worse." She looked at Richard Calloway for another moment. Then she picked up the bread basket, which still had 2 rolls in it, and she stood up. Jack watched her. "Evelyn." "I'll be right back," she said. She walked across the restaurant. Richard looked up when she arrived at his table. His expression was complicated, defensive, and underneath the defensiveness, something that might have been embarrassment if it had been given enough room. She set the bread basket on his table. "The soup is very good tonight," she said. "Phil makes it himself. You should try it." Richard stared at her. "Mrs. Harper." "I know why you did that," she said quietly, not unkindly, directly. "You walked in and you saw something that didn't make sense to you, and you felt outside of it. And the only way you knew how to handle outside was to push." He said nothing. His jaw was working slightly, the way jaws do, when people are deciding whether to be defensive or honest and haven't made up their minds yet. "My husband had a brother who did the same thing his whole life," Evelyn said. "Spent 60 years pushing at things that frightened him. Died without ever finding out that they weren't as frightening as he thought." She looked at Richard steadily. "You don't have to sit alone in this corner all night." A long silence. "I was not kind," Richard said finally. His voice was lower now, stripped of the authority he'd walked in with. What was underneath it was less impressive and considerably more human. "No," Evelyn agreed, "you weren't. Those men are people," she said. "Just people, same as you, same as me." She paused. "Some of them are more broken than others, but then so are we." Richard looked at her. Something was moving behind his eyes, slow and reluctant, like a door opening that hadn't been opened in a long time. "My wife left me," he said abruptly, the way people say things they didn't plan to say. 8 months ago. She said I spent our entire marriage making her feel like a problem I was managing." He said it with no drama, just the flat, exhausted tone of someone who has had a long time to sit with the truth. I'm in Cedar Ridge because she got the house in Billings, and I'm looking at property to build something. He stopped. Or, that's what I told myself. I don't know, maybe I just needed to be somewhere I didn't know anybody for a while. Evelyn sat down across from him, not because she had planned to, but because Thomas's voice in her head said clearly and unmistakably, "Sit down, Evelyn." "What's her name?" Evelyn asked. Richard blinked. "Margaret." "How long were you married?" 26 years. "Do you love her?" The question landed on him like something physical. He looked down at the table. "Yes," he said, like it cost him something. "Then that's not finished," Evelyn said. "Whatever you think you've built and lost and broken, that particular thing is not finished unless you decide it is." "She left," he said. "That seems fairly final." "Thomas and I had an argument in March, 6 weeks before he died," Evelyn said. "A real one. I've spent 9 months wishing I'd said different things." She looked at Richard. "You're sitting in a restaurant in Cedar Ridge, Montana. Margaret is somewhere tonight. That's different from what I have. Don't waste the difference." Richard Calloway looked at this 79-year-old woman in a red dress who had walked across a restaurant to bring him bread and tell him the truth, and something in his face that had been locked for a long time came visibly loose. "Come sit with us," Evelyn said. "You don't have to perform anything. You don't have to explain yourself to anyone. Just come sit." Richard looked at table 12, at Jack, who had watched this whole exchange with the same unhurried calm he'd brought to everything else tonight. Jack didn't nod, didn't gesture. He just looked back at Richard with an expression that wasn't welcoming exactly, but wasn't closed either. It was the expression of a man who had decided not to make someone's choice for them. Richard stood. He picked up his coat. He walked across the restaurant. He pulled out the one remaining empty chair at table 12, the last one as if it had been saved, and sat down. Nobody cheered. Nobody made it a moment. Tommy poured him a coffee without being asked. Connor slid the remaining bread roll toward him. Phil appeared from the kitchen with a bowl of soup. "On the house," Phil said. Richard looked at the soup. He looked at the coffee. He looked around the table at the collection of people he had walked in, wanting to remove from the room, and who had, through a series of events he was still processing, become the only company available to him on Christmas Eve. "I owe some of you an apology," he said. "Yeah," Tommy said amiably. "You do, but the soup's going to get cold, so maybe start there and work up to it." And Richard Calloway, who had built half the commercial real estate in Cascade County and had not eaten a meal in someone else's company for 8 months, picked up his spoon and started with the soup. Outside, the storm pushed against the windows, and the highway stayed closed, and Cedar Ridge disappeared further under white, and inside Pine Creek Grill, the night moved past midnight into the strange suspended hours that belong only to Christmas, and table 12 held every person it had gathered, and not one of them was ready to leave. The clock behind the bar read 12:17 when Connor's mother walked through the door. Nobody had been expecting her. The storm was still bad, the highway still closed, and when the door swung open and brought a blast of frozen air with it, every head at table 12 turned with the instinctive alertness of people who had spent the last hour in a room that kept surprising them. She was small, maybe 5'4", with Connor's same dark eyes and the particular exhaustion of a woman who had been on her feet for 14 hours and had driven through a whiteout to get to her kid anyway. Her coat was inadequate for the weather, the kind of coat you buy when you're choosing between adequate and the electric bill, and her gas station name tag was still pinned to her shirt underneath it. Her name, the tag said, was Diane. She saw Connor before she saw anything else. "Mom," Connor was already standing. "I told you I was fine. You didn't have to." "I drove through a blizzard," Diane said with the flat certainty of a mother who has made a decision and is not interested in debating it, "to sit in a warm restaurant with my kid on Christmas Eve. Don't tell me I didn't have to." She pulled him into a hug that he accepted with the particular combination of relief and embarrassment that is the exclusive territory of 15-year-old boys being hugged by their mothers in public. He was taller than her by 3 inches, and she held on anyway. Over his shoulder, she looked at table 12. She took it in, all of it. The bikers, the truck driver, the nurse, the man in the expensive coat who was staring into his soup with the expression of someone doing serious internal work, the restaurant owner, and the old woman in the red dress at the center of it all, who was looking at Diane with an expression of such warm, uncomplicated welcome that Diane felt something in her chest loosen without warning. You must be Connor's mother, Evelyn said. I must be, Diane said, still holding her son. He's been excellent company, Evelyn said. Sit down. Phil will get you something warm. Diane looked at Evelyn for a moment. Then she looked around the table again. Then she looked at Connor, who gave her the smallest nod, a nod that communicated something she couldn't fully translate, but that felt unmistakably like, it's okay, Mom, these are good people. She sat down. Phil appeared with coffee before she'd finished removing her coat. She wrapped both hands around the mug and said, the pass is opening in about an hour. Highway Patrol just announced it. Roads should be passable by 2. The table absorbed this. For most of them, it meant the evening was finite now, that the suspended quality of the last several hours, the sense of being sealed in together with no particular timeline, was moving toward an ending. Evelyn felt it. The shift, the way a room changes when people begin to understand that something is almost over. She didn't want it to be over. She hadn't expected to feel that. She had driven to Pine Creek Grill tonight, wanting only to survive the evening. What she had gotten instead was something she didn't have a clean word for, something that sat in her chest, warm and complicated, and entirely unlike fine. Jack felt the shift too. She could see it in the way he straightened slightly, the way his eyes moved around the table with something deliberate in them, cataloging the way a person does when they're trying to hold something in memory. Tell me something, Gerald said to the table in general. He had the tone of a man who had been thinking about a question for a while and had finally decided to ask it. All of you. What's the one thing you know now that you wish you'd known 20 years ago? Silence. Not an uncomfortable silence, a thinking one. Dennis went first. That asking for help doesn't mean you lost, he said. I spent 20 years thinking I had to carry everything myself, my wife, my problems, my grief, all of it alone. Thought that was what strength looked like. He shook his head. It looked like isolation, I just didn't know the difference yet. That people don't leave because you're not enough, Paul said quietly. They leave because something between you stopped working. And that's not the same thing. It took me a very long time to understand those are not the same thing. Sandra was quiet for a moment. Then, that grief doesn't go away. It just changes shape. I spent years waiting to be done grieving my father. Thought one day I'd wake up and it would be finished. It doesn't finish. You just get bigger than it, slowly. It doesn't shrink. You grow. The table held that. Evelyn looked at Sandra. How long has he been gone? 11 years, Sandra said, and I still reach for the phone to call him when something good happens. Thomas has been gone 9 months, Evelyn said, and I still make 2 cups of coffee every morning. Sandra reached across the table and put her hand over Evelyn's. Nobody said anything for a moment. They didn't need to. It was Connor who broke the silence, and he did it the way teenagers sometimes do, by saying the truest thing in the room in the plainest possible language. I know I'm only 15, he said, so I don't have 20 years. But I think I'd tell myself, he stopped looking for it. I'd tell myself that the people who show up for you aren't always who you expect. And you should let them, even when it's weird, even when it doesn't make sense. He glanced around the table. Like tonight. Diane looked at her son. Something crossed her face that she didn't try to hide. When did you get smart? She said. I've always been smart, Connor said. You just don't always notice. She laughed. It was the kind of laugh that had crying right behind it, and she knew it, and she let it be anyway. Jack had been quiet during this exchange, listening with the focused attention he brought to everything. Now he said, 20 years ago, I would have told myself, stop running toward things that feel like freedom and away from things that feel like responsibility, because sometimes they're the same thing. He turned his coffee cup. The road feels like freedom, but I've spent enough time on it to know that freedom without somebody to come home to is just distance. Tommy looked at him. Something passed between them, some long-standing conversation compressed into a look. You thinking about stopping? Tommy asked. I'm thinking about slowing down, Jack said. There's a difference. Is there? I'll tell you when I figure it out. Richard Calloway, who had been quiet since sitting down, not the aggressive silence of before, but a different kind, the kind that comes from listening, said, I would have told myself to stop keeping score. He said it without looking up from his coffee. I kept score in my marriage. Every sacrifice I made, every concession, every time I gave ground, I wrote it all down. In my head, thought I was being fair. Thought fairness meant keeping track. He stopped. Margaret told me once that living with me felt like living with an auditor. I thought she was being unfair. A long pause. She wasn't. Nobody offered him absolution. Nobody told him it was okay or that he'd done his best or that Margaret probably understood. They just let the truth he'd said sit there respected and undecorated. That was its own kind of kindness. Call her, Evelyn said. Richard looked up. Not tonight necessarily, Evelyn said. But soon, before you build any more real estate. She looked at him steadily. A man who can drive through a Montana blizzard and sit down with strangers and admit what you just admitted, that man has not run out of road yet. Richard held her gaze for a long moment. You're a remarkable woman, Mrs. Harper, he said finally. I'm a 79-year-old widow who came here tonight to eat dinner alone and cry into my soup, Evelyn said. The bar was low. I exceeded it. Laughter moved around the table, real laughter, the kind that comes from somewhere true. And then Jack stood up. He didn't make an announcement. He just stood and reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and came out with a small card. Plain white, handwritten number. He set it on the table in front of Evelyn. That's my number, he said. Call anytime. I mean that literally. Anytime. Evelyn looked at the card. For a moment, she didn't trust herself to speak. 9 months of mornings with 2 coffee cups. 9 months of cold sheets and unanswered grief and fine. 9 months of being a problem that nobody knew how to solve. So they'd called once a week and hoped the calls would be enough. And this man, this stranger with the scar on his jaw and the road in his eyes, was standing at a restaurant table at 12:30 in the morning on Christmas and handing her a card with his number on it and saying, call anytime, with the complete, uncomplicated sincerity of a person who meant exactly what they said. Jack, she said, and her voice was steady, but only just. I need to tell you something. Go ahead, he said. When I drove here tonight, she said, I was not planning to make it to the new year. The table went absolutely still. Not dramatically still, not the held breath stillness of a movie. The quiet, terrible stillness of people who have just heard something real. Jack sat back down. He sat back down without urgency, without panic, without the particular smothering energy of someone who has heard a frightening thing and is reacting to their own fear rather than the other person's need. He sat down and he looked at her and he said simply, tell me. Evelyn took a breath. I wasn't going to do anything, she said quickly, because she felt the alarm around the table and wanted to address it. I wasn't going to hurt myself. It wasn't that. It was more, she looked for the word. I had stopped minding. Whether I woke up in the morning or not, whether the next day came, I wasn't fighting for it anymore. She looked at her hands. And I didn't tell anyone because there's nothing to tell technically. Nothing was happening. I was just fading, voluntarily. The silence stretched. Sandra spoke first, and she spoke carefully the way she'd been trained to not rushing, not performing concern. When did it start? She asked. October, Evelyn said. Maybe September, if I'm honest. The leaves started to turn, and I thought Thomas will never see autumn again. And for some reason, that was the thing that did it. Not his death, not the funeral, not the first month or the first 2 months. The leaves turning. Because it was ordinary, Sandra said. Because it was ordinary, Evelyn confirmed. Death I was prepared for. I'd been preparing for it for a year. But autumn was just supposed to happen. Every year, without asking anyone's permission. She looked up, and it did, and he wasn't there for it. And I thought, what is any of this for? Jack had not looked away from her face. And tonight, he said. Evelyn considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Tonight, she said slowly, I have laughed 4 times, genuinely laughed, not the polite kind. I have said Thomas's name out loud more than I have in 2 months. I have watched a 15-year-old boy find out that a man who didn't know him 2 hours ago thinks he's worth fighting for. She looked at Connor, who was very still and very young looking, and watching her with wide eyes. I have watched a man who drove people away his whole life take his first step back toward the person he loves. She glanced at Richard, who had the grace to look at the table. And I have been sitting with people who told me the truth about hard things without flinching. She put her hand flat on the table. I am not fading tonight, she said. Tonight, I am entirely, completely here. Jack put his hand over hers. Not a romantic gesture, not a performance. The gesture of a person who has put his hand on the arm of a fellow human being because the moment required it, and he was not afraid of moments. Goodwood, he said. Tommy, whose Oklahoma composure had remained intact through most of the evening, was looking at the far wall with the very specific expression of a man who is refusing to cry in a restaurant on Christmas Eve through sheer force of will. "I'm fine," Tommy announced to no one in particular in a voice that suggested the opposite. "You don't have to be," Evelyn said. Tommy looked at her. "Nobody at this table has to be fine," she said. "I believe I established that early on." Tommy pressed his mouth together. Then he said roughly, "Your husband sounds like he was a hell of a man, Mrs. Harper." "He really was," she said. "He really genuinely was." Diane had her arm around Connor and was looking at Evelyn with an expression that was doing several things at once. Gratitude, recognition, a kind of grief she hadn't expected to feel tonight for a woman she'd just met. "Mrs. Harper," she said, "my son texted me tonight and said he was with good people. He doesn't say things like that. He's 15. He says things like, 'I'm fine,' and 'it's whatever,' and 'don't worry about it.'" She paused. "He said good people. That was you." Evelyn shook her head. "That was all of us." "It started with you," Diane said. Evelyn started to disagree. Then she looked at Jack, who was watching her with an expression that said quietly and without words, "Let people give you things. You've been giving for 9 months. Let this one in." "All right. All right." It was Phil who heard it first. He came out from the kitchen, where he'd been pretending to clean things that didn't need cleaning in order to give the table its privacy, and he said, "Highway Patrol just called. Pass is opening. Roads are passable." The table heard it, and nobody moved, not immediately, not the way people move when they've been waiting to leave. They move the way people move when they've been somewhere that mattered and aren't quite ready for it to be past tense. Jack finally stood. The other riders followed, not abruptly, not all at once, but gradually, with the unhurried gravity of men who had spent an evening becoming something they hadn't walked in as and weren't in a hurry to leave behind. Roy helped Evelyn with her coat. Dennis picked up her purse from the floor where it had slid without her noticing. Tommy left a tip on the table that made Karen, when she found it, have to sit down for a moment. Gerald shook hands around the table with the same ceremony he'd arrived with. Then he shook Jack's hand and held it for a moment. "I'm going to call my daughter," he said. "When I get to Spokane, I'm going to call her." "Tell her what you told us," Jack said. "About the money thing going sideways." "About missing her," Jack said. "Lead with that." Gerald nodded. He picked up his coat. He walked out into the night. Richard Calloway was the last to stand aside from Evelyn. He buttoned his cashmere coat with the precise habitual movements of a man performing a familiar ritual differently than he had before, slower, more aware of it. He looked around the table one more time. "I owe each of you an apology," he said. "I said it before, but I mean it more now. I walked in here with a head full of assumptions, and I was wrong on every count." He stopped. "I'm not always good at being wrong." "Nobody is," Dennis said. "You get better with practice." Richard almost smiled. "I'm going to call Margaret tomorrow," he said. "Christmas morning. I don't know what I'll say." "Start with her name," Evelyn said. "Just say her name like you mean it. The rest will follow." Richard looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached into his coat pocket and took out his own card, the glossy embossed kind with the company logo. And he crossed out the office number with his pen and wrote a different number beneath it. He set it on the table in front of Evelyn. "If you ever need anything," he said, "I mean that in the most practical sense. Anything." Evelyn picked up the card. She held it next to Jack's card, the plain white handwritten one. She looked at both of them. "I came here tonight with nothing," she said almost to herself. "And now I have—" She looked up at the table, at all of them, at this collection of people who had no reason to be here and had been here anyway. "I have all of this." The bikers filed out into the cold. Through the window, Evelyn watched them start their engines, one by one, watched the parking lot fill with that rolling, powerful sound that had frightened everyone in the restaurant 3 hours ago, and now somehow sounded like something else entirely. It sounded, she thought, like company. Jack was the last one to his bike. He stopped at the door and turned back to look at her. She was still at the table. Her coat was on. Her purse was in her lap. She was sitting in the chair she had sat in since 7 o'clock, and the chair across from her, Thomas's chair, had been filled and emptied over the course of an extraordinary night, and now it was empty again. But it didn't look the same as it had at 7 o'clock. At 7 o'clock, the empty chair had been an absence. Now it looked like something that could be filled. "Next Christmas Eve," Jack said from the doorway. "You won't be alone." Evelyn Harper looked at him across the restaurant where she had sat for 48 years at the table, where her husband's chair was empty on the Christmas Eve, that had become the most unexpectedly alive night she had experienced in 9 months. I know, she said, and for the first time since Thomas died, she believed it. Jack kept his promise. Evelyn didn't entirely believe he would, not because she doubted him specifically, but because she had reached an age where she had learned the difference between what people meant when they said something and what they were actually capable of delivering when the moment of inconvenience arrived. People meant things. They meant them completely in the warm light of a restaurant on Christmas Eve with snow on the ground and emotion in their chests. And then January came and February, and the ordinary weight of ordinary life pressed down and the meaning stayed, but the follow-through got quiet. She drove home that night with Jack's card on the passenger seat and told herself she was glad for the evening and not to expect anything more from it. Her phone rang on December 27th. She almost didn't answer it. The number wasn't one she recognized. Mrs. Harper, Jack's voice, unhurried. Just checking you made it through the holiday. She sat down on the kitchen chair, the one closest to the phone, the one Thomas used to sit in when he paid bills at the table. I did, she said. You rode to Spokane, had dinner with Dennis's sister. She makes a pie that would make Tommy cry. Did Tommy cry? Came close. She laughed. Genuine, unperformed, the kind that lived in her chest for a moment after it was over. They talked for 40 minutes. About nothing specific. About the drive, about the storm, about a documentary Jack had watched in a motel room, about ocean migration patterns that had somehow kept him awake until 2 in the morning. About a bird feeder Thomas had built in the backyard that Evelyn still filled every morning out of habit, and how she'd started to think of it not as habit, but as continuation. Continuation, Jack said, like he was turning the word over. I like that. Thomas would have hated it, Evelyn said. He was very literal. He would have said, Evelyn, he's gone, the bird feeder is just a bird feeder. And what would you have said back? I would have said, Thomas the bird feeder is never just a bird feeder, and he would have sighed and gone back to his newspaper, and that would have been the end of it. Jack laughed. It was a good sound, low and real, not a polite sound. I'm going to call you again, he said when they hung up. That all right? I expect you to, Evelyn said. He called every 2 weeks through January. Every week in February when Montana winter pressed hardest and the days were short and the mornings were the kind of gray that had no bottom. He called from rest stops and from diners and once from a parking lot in New Mexico where he'd stopped to watch a sunset. And he described the sunset to her in such plain, specific terms, the exact shade of the light, the way it hit the desert floor, the feeling of the air cooling fast that she felt she'd seen it. She started to tell him things she hadn't told anyone. About the bad mornings, about the way grief came in waves that she'd stopped trying to predict or control the way a wave would arrive in the middle of something completely mundane, folding laundry, buying soup at the grocery store, and simply knock her down for a while. About the evening in February, when she sat in Thomas's chair for 3 hours without turning on a light, not because she was sad exactly, but because sitting in his chair in the dark felt like the most honest thing she could do. Did it help? Jack asked. Yes, she said, which surprised me. Why so? Because it sounds like the kind of thing that shouldn't help, she said. It sounds like wallowing. Thomas would have said I was wallowing. Thomas wasn't there, Jack said, not unkindly, just true. You were, and you needed what you needed. She held the phone for a moment after he said it. You're very good at this, she said. At what? At saying the right thing without making it sound like a right thing. A pause. I had a lot of years of saying the wrong thing, and he said, you learn by contrast. In March, Sandra called. Evelyn hadn't expected that either. She had Sandra's number. They'd exchanged them at the restaurant, the way you do at the end of an evening. That feels significant. But 3 months had passed, and she'd assumed again that the warm feeling of exchange would be the whole of it. Sandra's voice on the phone was different from the restaurant voice, less composed, more tired. I had a patient tonight, Sandra said without preamble. 77 years old, came in alone, no emergency contact on file, and I sat with her for 20 minutes between shifts because she stopped. Because I kept thinking about you, sitting at that table before we all came, and I thought I'm not going to let this woman sit in a hospital bed on a Tuesday night without someone sitting with her. Evelyn felt the back of her eyes sting. How was she? Evelyn asked. She was fine, Sandra said. She is going to be completely fine. A pause. She told me nobody had held her hand in 2 years, since her sister died. 2 years, and then a Tuesday night in a hospital, and a nurse she'd never met sat with her for 20 minutes. Sandra's voice was steady, but only just. I almost didn't do it. I almost told myself I didn't have time. I had time. Sandra, Evelyn said, you have to keep doing that. I know, Sandra said. Every time, Evelyn said. Every patient who's alone, every person sitting in a corner somewhere with fine on their face like a closed door. You have to keep opening the door. That's going to be exhausting, Sandra said. Yes, Evelyn agreed, but it's the kind of exhaustion that means you're living right. Sandra was quiet for a moment. Then how are you, Evelyn, really? I'm better than I was, Evelyn said. I'm not fine, but I'm better than fine. There's more room in me than there was. In April, Connor came by. He knocked on her door on a Saturday afternoon with a casserole dish wrapped in a kitchen towel and the expression of a 15-year-old boy who has been dispatched on an errand by his mother and is choosing to take it seriously. My mom made this, he said. She said you mentioned you don't always feel like cooking. She made extra. Evelyn looked at the casserole dish, then at Connor. Come in, she said. I'll make coffee. I don't drink coffee, he said. I'm 15. Then I'll make hot chocolate, and you will not say a single word about it being childish. I wasn't going to, he said with dignity. He sat at her kitchen table, Thomas's chair, the bill-paying chair, the chair she'd been slowly reclaiming from grief, and she made hot chocolate. And they sat together, and Connor told her about school and his mother and a history project he was doing about the Montana copper mining era. And she told him about Thomas, who had grown up 40 miles from the old Anaconda smelter, and whose grandfather had worked the mines, and whose hands, even at the end, had the particular roughness of a man descended from people who worked with their hands. Connor listened the way he'd listened at the restaurant, fully, without waiting for his turn to talk. Can I ask you something, he said. You may, she said. That night at the restaurant, when you told Jack you hadn't been planning to make it to the new year. He held his mug. Did you mean that? Evelyn looked at him. He was watching her with Thomas's kind of directness, the look that didn't flinch. Yes, she said, I meant it. And now, she thought about the bird feeder, about the phone calls, about Sandra with the 77-year-old patient, about this boy sitting in her kitchen on a Saturday with a casserole his mother had made because somebody had told him 2 months ago that he was worth fighting for. Now, Barham, she said, I am extremely interested in what happens next. Connor nodded, satisfied, like a person who asked a question and got the answer they were hoping for without quite wanting to admit they'd been hoping. Good, he said. The twist arrived in May, and it arrived in the form of a phone call from a number Evelyn didn't recognize, and a voice she didn't know. Mrs. Harper, my name is Lucy Alderman. I'm a reporter for the Cedar Ridge Gazette. I've been hearing a story about last Christmas Eve, about a table at Pine Creek Grill. I was wondering if I might talk with you. Evelyn held the phone. Who told you, she said. Karen, Lucy said, the waitress. She said she'd been carrying it around for 4 months and she needed to put it somewhere. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. What kind of story do you want to write? She asked. An honest one, Lucy said, about loneliness, about what people do with it, about what happened at that table. A pause. About you. I don't want to be the story, Evelyn said. I'm the least interesting person who was there. With respect, Mrs. Harper. Every person I've talked to said the evening started with you. The way you looked at Jack. The way you talked to the man in the corner. The way you made room for everyone without making it a production. Lucy paused. That's the story. Evelyn thought of Thomas. Thomas, who had driven a school bus for 22 years and known every child's name and never once thought of himself as remarkable. Write about the table, Evelyn said finally. Not about me, about what happens when people stop pretending they're fine. The article ran in June. By July, Phil's phone at Pine Creek Grill was ringing with calls from people who had read it. People in Cedar Ridge, people in Billings, people in places Evelyn had never been asking about Christmas Eve, asking about the table, asking if it was going to happen again. Phil called Evelyn. It's happening again, he said without preamble. Right, tell me it's happening again. Evelyn called Jack. Jack was quiet for a moment when she explained. Then he said, I've already been thinking about it. I know you have, she said. 20 riders this year, he said. Maybe more. Word got out. Phil says people are already asking about reservations. For Christmas Eve. For Christmas Eve, she confirmed. Another pause. Then Jack said, Evelyn, I need to tell you something. His voice was different, Not alarming steady as always, but underneath it was something she hadn't heard from him before. Something careful. Tell me, she said. I've been riding since I was 19, he said. I've spent 23 Christmas Eves on a road somewhere, parking lots, diners, once a truck stop outside Flagstaff that smelled like diesel and bad decisions. A pause. Last Christmas Eve was the first one in 23 years that I didn't want to leave. Evelyn held very still. That table, Jack said, what it was, what you made it be. He stopped. I've been trying to figure out how to say this without it sounding like something it's not. Just say it, Evelyn said gently. You reminded me what the point is, he said. I've been riding for 23 years looking for something I couldn't name. And that night at that table, I think I was sitting right next to it. He paused. You, all of you, the whole ridiculous table. Evelyn was quiet for a long moment. Jack, she said. Yeah. Thomas would have liked you, she said. Enormously. He would have argued with you about everything, and he would have liked you enormously. Jack didn't say anything for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was rougher than usual. I would have liked that, he said. The second Christmas Eve came. 22 riders. Phil had pushed 3 tables together, and it still wasn't enough. Sandra came directly from her shift, still in her scrubs, and she brought 2 colleagues who had been alone the previous Christmas and hadn't forgotten it. Gerald drove in from Spokane 10 hours in December just because, and said when he walked in that he'd called his daughter in October and they'd talked for 2 hours and she was coming to see him in the spring. Connor came with this, and Connor was 16 now and had grown 2 inches and had written a school essay about Christmas Eve that his history teacher had read aloud to the class without knowing it was autobiographical, and the class had been very quiet afterward. Richard Calloway came. He came with Margaret. They walked in together, and Evelyn saw them from across the room. Richard with his cashmere coat and his careful posture, and something new in his face that hadn't been there the year before, something open and a little frightened and entirely alive. Margaret was small and dark-haired with the alert eyes of a woman who had made a decision and was still in the process of trusting it. Richard brought her straight to Evelyn. This is Margaret, he said. I told her about you. What did you tell her? Evelyn asked. I told her you said to lead with her name, Richard said. I did. On Christmas morning, I called her and said Margaret, and she didn't hang up. He looked at his wife. She didn't hang up. Margaret looked at Evelyn with an expression that was doing several things at once. He's been different since last Christmas, she said. I don't know exactly what happened at this table. He tried to explain, and the explanation was unusual. It was an unusual evening, Evelyn said. He stopped keeping score, Margaret said quietly. He doesn't even know he's doing it, but he stopped. Evelyn looked at Richard. Richard looked at the table. He had the expression of a man who has been accurately described and has decided to accept it as a compliment. Sit down, Evelyn said. Both of you. Tommy's going to eat all the pie, and then you'll be sorry. I heard my name, Tommy said from across the table without looking up. The third year, there were 50. The fourth, the restaurant put up a sign in November reserved Christmas Eve community dinner, and people called to add their names to the list. People who were alone, people who were passing through, people who had read the Gazette article or heard the story from someone who had been there, or simply felt the gravitational pull of a thing that was real in a world full of things that weren't. The HELLS Angels arrived first every year, always. Before the other guests, before the extra staff, before Phil had finished pushing the tables together, they were there, reserving seats for strangers, pulling up chairs, making sure no one walked into the room and couldn't find a place at the table. That was the rule Jack established and never had to say out loud, you arrive first, you make room, and you stay until everyone who needs a place has one. Evelyn was 84 when she died. It was a Tuesday in November early before the real cold had settled in for the season. She went peacefully in her own home, in the bed she had shared with Thomas for 48 years, with the bird feeder visible through the window, and a cup of coffee on the bedside table, because some habits are not habits at all, but simply the shape of a life. She had asked Jack in September to do something for her. At the funeral, she said, I want you to tell people about the table, not about me about the table, about what it means to pull up a chair. I'm not much for public speaking, Jack said. You walked across a restaurant full of frightened people to sit with a lonely old woman, Evelyn said. You can stand in front of a room and say 7 words. He did. More than 100 riders came to Cedar Ridge for Evelyn Harper's funeral. They lined the street outside the church, their bikes in a row, their engines quiet for the first time. Inside, Connor, 17 now and considerably taller than anyone had expected, sat in the front row next to Diane. Sandra sat beside them. Gerald drove from Spokane again, not for a Christmas Eve, just because. Richard and Margaret sat together, and Margaret held Richard's hand, and Richard led her without calculating what it cost him. Jack stood at the front of the church. He didn't use notes. He said, Evelyn Harper sat alone at a restaurant on Christmas Eve, and she was afraid. Not of us, not of the leather jackets or the bikes or the patches. She was afraid that the world had moved on without her, that she had become something the world set down and forgot to pick back up. He paused. She was wrong, but she did not know she was wrong yet. And that's the thing about the dark, you can't see your way out of it until somebody walks toward you with a light. He paused. She taught me that the light isn't a grand gesture. It's a small one. It's pulling up a chair, it's sitting down, it's saying 7 words to a stranger in a restaurant and meaning every one of them. He placed a small Christmas ornament on the casket, white hand-painted. On it, in small, careful letters, no one should eat Christmas Eve alone. The church was very quiet. Then Connor from the front row said clearly and without embarrassment, she told me she was extremely interested in what happens next. And somehow in the middle of grief, the room laughed. Genuinely, warmly. The way people laugh when a truth arrives in unexpected clothing. That Christmas Eve Pine Creek Grill was full. Every seat, every table pushed together, every chair occupied. Phil stood behind the bar and looked at the room and pressed his lips together and looked at the ceiling for a moment and then went back to the kitchen because there was work to do and he was a practical man, and good and practical on nights like this are exactly the same thing. The Hells Angels arrived first. They always arrived first. Jack sat at table 12 in the corner booth by the frost-edged window, and the chair across from him was empty for exactly 4 minutes before an elderly man in a brown coat came in alone and looked around the room with the careful, hoping eyes of someone who wasn't sure if there was a place for him. Jack stood up. He waved the man over. He pulled out the chair. And he said 7 words that Evelyn Harper had made permanent, had stitched into the fabric of a small Montana town, and the hearts of everyone who had ever sat at that table on a cold December night and discovered that family is not always the people who share your blood. Sometimes family is the person who notices you're alone. Sometimes family is the one who pulls up a chair. And sometimes, if you are very lucky, on the right winter night, in the right room, full of the wrong people who turn out to be exactly right. Sometimes family is all of it at once, arriving without warning. Loud as motorcycles, quiet as 7 words, permanent as a promise kept.